It was a regular Tuesday afternoon when I got the call. The kind of day that makes you feel like you are just going through the motions. I had been working as a plumber for years now, driving around the suburbs, fixing leaky pipes, clogged drains, and all sorts of household disasters. But nothing prepared me for what was about to happen that day. Her name was Susan. I saw the name pop up on my work order, just another house on a quiet street in a middle-class neighborhood. I did not think much of it at the time, just another customer in need of my services. The request was simple: leaky sink in the kitchen. Easy enough. I grabbed my toolbox, hopped in my truck, and headed over, expecting to be in and out in an hour, tops. When I pulled up to the house, it looked like any other place. Modest, well-kept, with a neatly trimmed lawn. I knocked on the door and waited. After a few moments, it opened, and there she was. Susan was in her 60s, older than I expected. But there was something about her. Something magnetic. She had this confidence, this way of holding herself that instantly caught my attention. She wore a loose robe, not too revealing, but it flowed around her like she was in total control of everything. And maybe it was just the way the afternoon sun hit her hair, but there was something almost alluring about her. She smiled, her eyes locking with mine for just a moment longer than usual, and I felt something stir inside me. "Hi, you must be Brad," she said, her voice warm and welcoming. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "No problem at all, ma'am," I replied, trying to keep it professional. But there was something about the way she said my name, something that made my heart skip a beat. I followed her into the house, her robe swishing softly as she walked. The place was cozy, with soft lighting and a faint smell of lavender in the air. It felt intimate. She led me to the kitchen, where the sink had been leaking. "It just started dripping a few days ago, but now it is getting worse," she explained, leaning against the counter, watching me with those eyes that seemed to see right through me. I knelt down to take a look at the pipes under the sink, trying to focus on the job, but I could feel her eyes on me, studying me. The silence between us was thick, heavy with something unspoken. I started to sweat, but it was not from the work. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was casual, but there was a hint of curiosity, something more personal. "About 10 years, I replied, my voice muffled as I worked. "It is a good job, steady work." She smiled, and I caught a glimpse of it out of the corner of my eye. "I bet it is. You look like you know what you are doing." There was something about the way she said it, like it was not just about the pipes. I felt a flush of heat rise to my face, and I shifted uncomfortably under the sink. Then, out of nowhere, I felt her hand on my shoulder. Just a light touch, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Was this really happening? I turned my head slightly, catching a glimpse of her standing over me, her fingers resting on my shoulder. "You must be strong, dealing with all these heavy tools and pipes," she said softly, her voice taking on a more intimate tone. "I admire that in a man." I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. This was definitely not part of the job description. I could feel her hand lingering on my shoulder, her fingers gently squeezing, and I had to resist the urge to lean into her touch. I guess so," I stammered, my mind racing. I was not sure if I should pull away or let it happen. My body was reacting, the tension between us growing by the second. I knew I should stay professional, but there was a part of me that did not want to. A part of me that was curious, excited even. She stepped closer, her body now only inches from mine. I could feel the heat radiating off her, and the air around us seemed to crackle with anticipation. This was wrong. So wrong. But why did it feel so damn right? "Is there anything else I can help you with?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew she was not talking about the sink anymore. I stood up slowly, wiping my hands on a rag, my mind still trying to catch up with what was happening. She was so close now, I could smell her perfume. Something soft, floral, and intoxicating. My heart was racing, and I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead. I think the sink is good now," I managed to say, my voice shaky. She smiled again, that same knowing smile, like she could see right through me. "Well, that is good to hear," she said, her eyes flicking down to my lips for just a second before meeting my gaze again. but I was hoping you might stick around for a little longer. There is something else I could use your help with." My pulse quickened. I should have walked away right then. I should have grabbed my tools and left. But I did not. Instead, I found myself stepping closer, closing the gap between us. My hand brushed against her arm, and I felt her shiver under my touch. "Susan," I started, but she cut me off with a soft shoo as she placed a finger on my lips. "Brad," she whispered, her eyes searching mine. "You do not have to say anything. I know you feel it too." I did. God help me, I did. Before I knew what was happening, she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine in the softest, most electric kiss I had ever felt. It was like a spark ignited between us, and suddenly, I could not think straight. My hands found their way to her waist, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened. She melted into me, her body pressing against mine, and all the tension, all the unspoken desire between us, exploded in that moment. For a split second, I thought about the consequences, about how wrong this was. But then her hands were in my hair, and I was lost. Lost in the feel of her, the taste of her, the way she made me forget about everything else. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other. I could feel the heat between us, the electricity that still buzzed in the air. "Susan, I do not know if we should." She placed a hand on my chest, silencing me once again. "Do not overthink it, Brad. We are both adults. We both know what we want. And God help me, she was right. There was no turning back now. The moment between us hung thick in the air, like a storm waiting to break. Susan's breath was hot against my neck, her fingers still tracing slow, deliberate circles on my chest. I could feel my heart pounding, my mind racing, every sensible thought telling me to stop, to step away. But my body was moving on instinct, driven by something deeper, something primal. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. "Susan, this is not. We should not." She looked up at me with those piercing eyes, the hint of a smile playing on her lips. "Brad, you are overthinking it." Her voice was low, soothing, like she had already made up her mind. And maybe she had. Maybe I had too. Her hands moved lower, sliding over my sides as she leaned in closer, her lips brushing against my jawline, sending a jolt of electricity through me. "No one has to know," she whispered, her words like a dare, like a promise. And that was the moment it all snapped. The line we were not supposed to cross? We had already crossed it. And now there was no stopping the inevitable. Without another word, I pulled her closer, my hands gripping her waist, feeling the soft fabric of her robe under my fingers. She gasped softly as I kissed her again, more urgently this time, more desperately. Her arms wrapped around my neck, and I could feel the heat between us, the tension building, thickening, until it was almost unbearable. We stumbled backward, barely able to keep our balance as we moved through the kitchen. The counter dug into my back, but I did not care. All I could think about was her. Her lips on mine, her body pressed against me, the way her breath hitched when I ran my hands down her sides. She pulled away just long enough to untie the knot of her robe, letting it slip off her shoulders and pool at her feet. My breath caught in my throat as I took her in, the sight of her sending a wave of heat through me that was impossible to ignore. She stood there in front of me, bold, unashamed, and completely captivating. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of what we were doing sinking in. This was wrong. So wrong. But I could not stop. I did not want to stop. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice low, almost a growl. Susan just smiled, stepping closer until our bodies were pressed together again. "I have never been more sure of anything," she said, her voice dripping with confidence, with certainty. And then she kissed me again, and everything else faded away. We moved together in a slow, deliberate dance, our hands exploring, our lips never straying too far from each other. It was like we were testing the boundaries, pushing them further and further until there was nothing left but the two of us, tangled together in the heat of the moment. Her touch was everywhere. My arms, my back, my chest, and each time she touched me, it sent a new surge of desire through my veins. I wanted her. No, I needed her. The kitchen felt too small, too cramped for what was happening between us. She pulled me toward the living room, her fingers gripping my shirt as we stumbled through the doorway. We barely made it to the couch before I pulled her down with me, our bodies crashing together in a tangle of limbs and heat. The feel of her skin against mine was intoxicating, like nothing I had ever experienced before. I could not get enough of her. Her smell, her taste, the way her body moved under my hands. I had never wanted anyone the way I wanted her in that moment. She straddled me, her hands on my chest, and I could feel her trembling with anticipation. The way she looked at me, with hunger and desire in her eyes, made it impossible to think straight. She leaned down, her lips brushing against my ear, and whispered, "I have been waiting for this." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I could feel the last of my control slipping away. This was it. We were too far gone now. There was no stopping what was happening between us, and I did not want to stop. My hands moved up her thighs, gripping her hips as she shifted against me, her body pressing down in a slow, deliberate rhythm that made my heart race. Every touch, every movement was driving me closer to the edge, and I could feel her unraveling too, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as we lost ourselves in each other. But just when I thought I could not take it anymore, she pulled back, her hands resting on my shoulders as she looked down at me, her chest rising and falling with each heavy breath. There was something in her eyes, something more than just desire, something deeper. "Brad," she whispered, her voice trembling just a little. This is not just about today." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was right. This was not just some casual fling, some spur-of-the-moment decision. There was something more between us. Something real. Something we were both afraid to admit, but could not ignore. I stared up at her, my hands still on her hips, my mind spinning. What was I doing? What were we doing? This was not supposed to happen. I was just here to fix her sink, for God's sake. And now everything was different. "We should stop," I said, though my hands tightened on her hips, betraying my words. Her eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought she might agree. But then she shook her head, her fingers tracing the line of my jaw. "No," she said softly, her voice firm. "I do not want to stop. Not now." I could feel my resolve crumbling, could feel the last of my willpower slipping away as she leaned down and kissed me again, slow and deliberate, like she was trying to make me forget everything else. And it was working. I kissed her back, my hands sliding up her back as I pulled her closer, my mind going blank. This was wrong. I knew it. But in that moment, I did not care. All I cared about was her, Susan, and the way she made me feel alive. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the moment was broken. The sound of a phone ringing echoed through the room, cutting through the haze of desire like a knife. We both froze, our breaths heavy, our bodies still tangled together. Susan pulled back, her eyes wide, her body trembling. That is my phone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She stood up slowly, grabbing her robe from the floor and wrapping it around herself as she hurried to answer the call. I sat there on the couch, my mind spinning, my body still humming with the intensity of what had just happened. This was not supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen, but it did. And now I did not know what to do. As I sat there, my heart still racing and my head spinning, I could hear Susan talking on the phone in the next room. Her voice was low, almost too quiet to make out, but I caught bits and pieces. It sounded like someone from her family, maybe her daughter, maybe someone else close to her. But whatever it was, the normalcy of it cut through the heated fog of what had just happened. I looked down at my hands, still trembling slightly from the adrenaline, and for the first time since I walked through that door, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. I had crossed a line. We had crossed a line. And now, sitting there alone in her living room, it all felt too real. I should have left. I knew that. But something kept me glued to the couch, waiting, listening to the muffled sound of her conversation. Maybe it was the unresolved tension hanging in the air, or maybe it was something deeper, something I had not been willing to face until now. Whatever it was, I could not bring myself to walk out that door. After a few minutes, Susan's voice grew louder, more distinct, as she finished her call. I heard the click of the phone being set down and the soft padding of her feet as she walked back into the room. She looked different now, more composed, but also more distant. She had wrapped her robe tightly around herself, as if trying to put a barrier between us. She sat down on the edge of the couch, not quite close enough to touch, but still within reach. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, the unspoken weight of everything that had just happened hanging between us. "I am sorry about that," she said, her voice soft but steady. "That was my daughter. She is checking in on me, as usual." I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything yet. My mind was still spinning, still trying to make sense of the mess we had just created. For a long moment, the room was filled with a heavy, uncomfortable silence. I could feel the weight of her gaze on me, and I knew she was waiting for me to say something, to do something. But what was I supposed to say? How do you even begin to make sense of something like this? Finally, I took a deep breath, forcing the words out. "Susan, I do not know what just happened here, but this cannot happen again." Her expression shifted, a flicker of something, disappointment, maybe, crossing her face. She looked down at her hands, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her robe. "I know," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know it should not have happened, but—" She paused, struggling to find the right words. "But I do not regret it. Not for a second." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that we had both made a mistake. But the truth was, deep down, I felt the same. As wrong as it was, I did not regret it either. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw the vulnerability beneath the confidence. She was not just some older woman looking for a quick fling. There was more to it than that, more to her than that. And maybe, just maybe, there was more to us. "Susan," I said, my voice low but firm, "this is complicated. I do not know what we are doing here, but I know it is not right. I came here to fix your sink. Not this." She smiled softly, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I know, Brad. I did not plan this either. But it just happened. You felt it too, did not you?" I did not answer right away. I could feel my heart pounding again, that same pull between us that had led to everything spiraling out of control. And the truth was, I had felt it. From the moment I stepped through her door, there was something there. Something neither of us could ignore. "Yeah," I admitted quietly. "I felt it." She shifted closer, her hand reaching out to rest on mine. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me all the same. "We are both adults," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We know what this is, but it does not have to be more than what it is right now." Her words hung in the air, filled with a quiet intensity that made my pulse quicken. I wanted to believe her, wanted to tell myself that this could be simple, that we could walk away from this without making a bigger mess. But deep down, I knew it was not that easy. I pulled my hand away, standing up from the couch as I tried to put some distance between us. "Susan, I cannot do this. I have to go." She stood up too, crossing the room until she was standing right in front of me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her body, could smell the faint scent of lavender clinging to her skin. "Brad, please." Her voice broke on the last word, and I could see the desperation in her eyes, the same desperation I had been feeling since the moment our lips first touched. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself. This was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but the pull between us was too strong to resist. I could feel it, like gravity, drawing me closer to her with every breath. Before I could stop myself, I reached for her, pulling her into my arms. She let out a soft gasp as our bodies collided, her hands clutching at my shirt as if she was afraid I might slip away again. And maybe I was. Maybe we both were. Our lips met again, this time with more urgency, more desperation. The kiss was intense, filled with all the unspoken tension and desire that had been building between us since the moment I walked through her door. Her hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, and I could feel the heat of her body pressing against mine. For a few moments, We were lost in each other, lost in the heat of the moment. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, I pulled away, my heart pounding in my chest. "We cannot keep doing this," I said, my voice hoarse. "I cannot." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and sadness. "I know," she whispered, "but I do not want you to go." I took a step back, trying to put some distance between us, but it felt impossible. The pull between us was still there, as strong as ever, and I knew that if I stayed even a moment longer, I would not be able to resist her. "I am sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I cannot stay." Before she could say anything else, I grabbed my tools and headed for the door, my heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. I could feel her eyes on me as I left, but I did not look back. I could not. If I did, I knew I would never leave. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit me like a slap in the face, clearing my head just enough to remind me of the reality of the situation. This was not just some meaningless fling. It was messy, complicated, and I had no idea how to untangle myself from it. But as I climbed into my truck and drove away, one thought kept echoing in my mind. This was not over. Not by a long shot. The drive home was a blur. My hands were gripping the steering wheel too tight, my mind spinning in circles, replaying every moment that had just unfolded. The heat of Susan's touch still lingered on my skin, her scent, her breath. All of it was etched into my mind. No matter how fast I drove or how loud I turned the radio, I could not drown it out. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. What was I doing? This was not me. I did not cross lines like that, did not let things get that far. But the truth was, with Susan, it had felt inevitable. From the moment I stepped into her house, something had been pulling me toward her, like a magnet, and I had not been able to fight it. But now, sitting in the empty silence of my truck, miles away from her, the weight of it all crashed down on me. This was not just some casual mistake. I had gone to fix a leaky sink, and I had left with so much more than that. I pulled into my driveway, shut off the engine, and sat there in the dark, trying to catch my breath. The night was cool, the air crisp, but my skin still felt hot, as if the touch of Susan's body was seared into me. I leaned back against the headrest, closing my eyes, trying to think clearly, but every time I tried to push it out of my mind, she was there. Her lips, her hands, the way she had looked at me like I was the only person in the world. The way she had made me feel. Alive. Desired. Needed. I had not felt that in years. Maybe that was part of it, I thought. Maybe it had not just been about her. It had been about me too. About feeling something again. Something real. But even as I told myself that, I knew it was more complicated. Much more complicated. The next morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach. I had barely slept, tossing and turning as my mind replayed every second of what had happened with Susan. I knew I needed to forget it, to move on, but the more I tried to push it away, the more it clung to me. I had never been in a situation like this before, never let myself get involved with a client like that. It was unprofessional, reckless, and worst of all, it had felt too good to regret. I spent the day going through the motions, driving from job to job, fixing pipes and faucets like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I could not stop thinking about Susan, about her smile, her laugh, the way she had looked at me when I walked out the door. That night, as I sat at home alone, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw her name. Susan. I stared at the phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to walk away and pretend none of this had ever happened. But another part of me, one I could not quite silence, wanted to see her again, to hear her voice, to know if she was feeling the same way I was. Before I could stop myself, I opened the message. "Hi, Brad. I am sorry if I made things complicated yesterday. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. If you ever want to talk, you know where to find me." The words were simple, but I could feel the weight behind them. She was reaching out, offering an olive branch. But more than that, she was opening the door again. A door I was not sure I was ready to walk through. I put the phone down, my mind racing. I should have just let it go. I should have left it at that, thanked her, and moved on. but something about the message lingered, pulling me back to her. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind at war with itself. I knew this was a bad idea, knew that getting involved with her again would only make things more complicated. But I could not stop thinking about her, about the way she had made me feel. Finally, against my better judgment, I picked up the phone and texted her back. "I'm okay, Susan. It was just unexpected, but I would not mind talking sometime." I hit send before I could second-guess myself, and the moment the message went through, I felt my heart start to race. What was I doing? This was insane. But the truth was, I wanted to see her again. I wanted to know what this was, what it could be. Her reply came almost instantly. "Come over." 2 words. Simple, direct, and yet they carried so much weight. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I should say no, knew that going back there would only make things worse. But the pull was too strong. I wanted to see her again. Needed to. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The drive to her house felt different this time. There was no uncertainty, no hesitation. I knew exactly where I was going, and I knew exactly what was waiting for me when I got there. My heart raced in my chest, my mind spinning as I tried to make sense of everything. But the truth was, I had stopped trying to make sense of it. I had stopped fighting it. When I pulled up to her house, the lights were on, casting a soft glow through the windows. I could see her silhouette moving inside, and my pulse quickened. I stepped out of the truck, my legs feeling heavier with each step toward her door. This was it. There was no turning back now. I knocked, and within seconds, the door opened. Susan stood there, dressed in a simple, elegant dress that clung to her curves in all the right ways. Her eyes met mine, and I saw something in them that mirrored what I was feeling. Desire, anticipation, maybe even a hint of nervousness. But there was something else too. Something deeper. Something that told me this was not just a casual encounter for her either. "Brad," she said softly, her voice warm and inviting. "I am glad you came." I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me with a soft click, sealing us in together. The air between us was charged, thick with tension, and I could feel my heart racing as she stepped closer. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, looking at each other, the weight of everything we had left unsaid hanging between us. Then, slowly, Susan reached out and took my hand, her fingers lacing through mine. "Let's not overthink this," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. And this time, I did not pull away. I leaned in, my lips brushing against hers, and in that moment, everything else faded away. There was no more doubt, no more hesitation. Just the two of us, tangled together in the heat of the moment, the pull between us too strong to resist. The kiss deepened, and all the tension, all the unspoken desire, exploded into something raw, something real. Her hands were on my chest, pulling me closer, and I could feel the heat of her body pressing against mine. It was different this time, more intense, more urgent. There was no holding back, no second thoughts. Just us, giving in to the moment, to the desire that had been building between us since the moment I walked through her door. We moved together, our bodies in perfect sync, and for the first time, I let myself stop thinking, stop questioning. I let myself feel, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. When it was over, we lay there, tangled together in the soft glow of the lamplight, our bodies still humming with the aftershocks of everything that had just happened. I stared up at the ceiling, my mind surprisingly clear. For the first time in days, I did not feel conflicted, did not feel weighed down by doubt. There was still so much we had to figure out, so much left unsaid. But for now, it was enough. Susan shifted beside me, her head resting on my chest, her breath soft and steady. "Brad," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet of the room. "Do you regret this?" I thought about her question, the weight of it settling over me. And then, finally, I shook my head. "No," I said softly, my fingers brushing through her hair. "I do not regret it." She smiled against my skin, and I could feel the tension in her body melt away. We were not sure what would come next, but for now, we had each other. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.